not about Netanyahu, it's not about this war, it's about double standards, and one question hovers over it above all, the question of who would protect the Jews. Who would you trust to protect them? The Europeans? The Arab world? No. History shows only one people will protect the Jewish people. The Jewish people. That's what Zionism is. Thank you.
Be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It doesn't say some anti-Zionists engage in anti-Semitism, which I don't disagree with. It doesn't say some anti-Semites hide behind the cloak of anti-Zionism, which again, I don't disagree with. Everything Douglas listed about what's happened in Toronto, disgusting, reprehensible. Those people are shameless bigots. But that's not what the motion says. The motion says anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. No ifs, no buts, no caveats, no exceptions.
In this video, you're about to see Douglas Murray criticize Mehdi Hasan in a heated debate about the Arab-Israeli conflict and the current war in Gaza. Although the topic is contentious, Douglas Murray effectively swayed the audience with his persuasive, powerful, and solid facts that obliterated Mehdi Hasan in this dispute. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism are concepts that are commonly misunderstood and mixed up. Let us have an overview of the key differences. Hate, prejudice, and discrimination against Jews as a religious, ethnic, or racial group is anti-Semitism. In contrast, opposition to Zionism scrutinizes the political ideology and actions of the State of Israel without targeting Jews, which is specifically anti-Zionism. Let's hear Douglas Murray's take on the subject.
When I was last here a couple of years ago, I just returned from the front line of the war in Ukraine, where I was with the Ukrainian armed forces. And for most of the last 8 months, I've been in Israel and Gaza, following the war there as closely as I can. And I won't go into all the details now that I could give you of what's happening. But I would just put it in perspective in this way, first of all. What happened on the 7th of October was not just a massive attack on innocent people inside Israel. It was the equivalent to about 6,000 Canadians being massacred and burned in their homes in one day. It was the equivalent of about 1,500 of your fellow Canadians being taken hostage. You know, you would have thought after an attack like the one that Hamas instigated, that started this terrible war, you would have thought that there would be some sympathy for the world, from the world. You might have thought the world would pay attention to the attack and at least pay attention to the people behind it. You might have expected, like me, that there might have been a worldwide opposition to the terrorists and rapists and murderers of Hamas. You might have thought there would be hatred around the world erupting, that the government of Qatar and its mouthpiece, Al Jazeera, its funding of Hamas and its hosting of the leadership of Hamas in Qatar. You might have thought there'd have been an outpouring of rage at the Islamic Revolutionary government in Tehran, but no. There was an immediate outpouring of rage against the state that had been attacked. Bring back our girls, we had 10 years ago in the war in northern Nigeria, which I also covered. Bring back our girls. No international campaign saying bring back our Jewish children. Believe all women, we've been told for years. But turns out, not if the raped women are Jews. The Jews can never win, because historically they've been hated for being rich and for being poor. They've been hated for integrating and for not integrating. They were hated for being stateless. Remember, rootless cosmopolitans, the far right used to say. And now they're hated for having a state. Today, the only really acceptable form of anti-Semitism, aside from the sewers of the far right, the only real tolerated form of anti-Semitism is anti-Zionism. And Zionism, as we just heard, is simply the right of the Jews to self-determination in their historic homeland. That's all. Anti-Semitism, as we've also just heard, is double standards against Jewish people or cruel and unfair treatment of people because they're Jews. This isn't very far away from home here. If this isn't anti-Semitism, can the audience here tell me why the following things have happened since October the 7th?
Douglas rightly points out how anti-Semitism can devastate not only the state, but also innocent civilians who are simply trying to live and earn a livelihood. The merciless slaughter of innocent civilians and the taking of over 100 Israelis hostage by Hamas are driven by deep-seated hatred of Jews and their race.
Israel is the only country in the world which, when it's attacked, gets attacked more. You know, the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is, as my late friend Jonathan Sachs said, it's a shape-shifting virus. It moves across the centuries. When you could hate people for their religion, the Jews were hated for their religion. Then you couldn't hate people for that anymore, so people hated the Jews for their race. And then, after the 20th century, people realized that wasn't such a great idea either. Now, the Jews are hated not for their religion or their race, but for having a state. People around the world hate them so much for it that Israelis are attacked when they have hostages taken, and this is to remember the 100 hostages still in captivity in Gaza, who, if they were given back by Hamas today, the war would be over. And they're also attacked when they rescue their hostages. You know, the interesting thing about anti-Semitism is
the causes of this animosity are varied. Anti-Semites may carry resentment towards Jews for having their own state or for perceived cultural differences, among other reasons. However, it is evident that the hatred and conflict are unlikely to cease anytime soon. The situation could potentially have improved if the hostilities had ended with the return of Israeli hostages and a cessation of attacks on Israel. Douglas Murray is fully accurate on this. A simple statistic can break one's heart just listening to it. During the 7th of October attack, not one or two, but 1,139 Israelis and foreign nationals were killed, including 766 civilians and 373 security personnel. Additionally, 251 Israelis and foreigners were taken captive in Gaza. Hamas said its attack was in response to Israel's continued occupation, blockade of Gaza, and settlements expansion.
Why in a Montreal suburb a synagogue should be firebombed, as happened in November. Why there should have been gunshots against the yeshiva. Why in Toronto a bookstore owned by a Jew should be attacked. Why a Molotov cocktail was thrown through a Jewish community center in Montreal. Why a Toronto Jewish deli in North York was firebombed. Why in Toronto the Orthodox synagogue was vandalized. Why in Toronto 2 men opened fire the other week on a Jewish girls' school. If it isn't anti-Semitism, tell me why just a week ago pro-Hamas protesters tried to go through Jewish areas in this city shouting not just Allahu Akbar, but, and I quote, sorry for the language, fucking filthy fucking Zionist pigs, dirty Zionist rats. Have you heard that language before? The Jews have. Now look, if you are interested in this motion, just bear this in mind. It's not about Netanyahu, it's not about this war, it's about double standards, and one question hovers over it above all, the question of who would protect the Jews. Who would you trust to protect them? The Europeans? The Arab world? No. History shows only one people will protect the Jewish people. The Jewish people. That's what Zionism is. Thank you.
He ended his side of the argument with one of the most decisive comments, saying that nobody can protect the Jews. Not the Europeans, not the Arabs, but only the Jews can help and protect the Jews. Considering this is just one of the many assaults on Israel carried out by the far-right members of Hamas. Let us now hear Mehdi Hasan's side of the argument.
In 1917, over 100 years ago, Arthur Balfour, the British Foreign Secretary, a card-carrying anti-Semite, a man who had denounced the evils of Jewish immigration into the UK, a man who referred to Jews as an alien and hostile people, he issued his Balfour Declaration, which promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It was the first time a major world power had come out in favor of Zionism, which at the time was a pretty new and pretty controversial movement calling not just for a Jewish homeland, but for the building of a Jewish majority state in Palestine. And yet the only Jewish member of the British cabinet at that time, a man named Edwin Samuel Montagu, adamantly opposed both Zionism, which he called a mischievous political creed, and the Balfour Declaration, which he referred to as anti-Semitic and a rallying ground for anti-Semites in every country in the world. The only Jewish member of the British cabinet, that is what he said. And yet tonight here in Toronto, over 100 years later, we are being asked to vote for a motion that would damn Montagu as the anti-Semite while praising Balfour as the champion of Jews and Judaism. That's ridiculous. In fact, this entire motion tonight is ridiculous, disingenuous, ahistorical. It says, be it resolved, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. It doesn't say some anti-Zionists engage in anti-Semitism, which I don't disagree with. It doesn't say some anti-Semites hide behind the cloak of anti-Zionism, which again, I don't disagree with. Everything Douglas listed about what's happened in Toronto, disgusting, reprehensible. Those people are shameless bigots. But that's not what the motion says. The motion says anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. No ifs, no buts, no caveats, no exceptions. Anyone who takes an anti-Zionist position is automatically, inherently, unavoidably anti-Jewish, an anti-Semite, a racist. It's not about Israelis. It's not about Israel. It's not about Gaza. And by the way, on the subject of Gaza, given Douglas gave us some math about the death toll on October the 7th, horrific death toll, which we all condemn, I would remind you also that the death toll inflicted on Gaza, the deaths and injuries in Gaza are the equivalent, if we're going to do the ratios, of 2 million Canadians. 2 million Canadians. But that's not what the debate is about. It's not even about Zionism itself. It's about the legitimacy of anti-Zionism, whether you can be anti-Zionist, opposed to Zionism, which remember is a political ideology, a nationalist movement, not a religion, not a race, not a protected class, whether you can be anti-Zionist without being smeared, tarred, demonized as an anti-Semite. And I want to be clear tonight. You could be the most pro-Israeli person in this room tonight, the most proud and ardent Zionist here, and still vote against this motion with a clear conscience. Still vote with our side, the right side. Because this motion is not about whether you are pro-Israel or pro-Zionist. It's about whether the rest of us have the right, the freedom to take a different view on Israel, on Zionism, on Benjamin Netanyahu even, without being silenced, without being told we're racists. We're not. Because anti-Semitism is hating Jews, the people, and Judaism, the religion. Anti-Zionism is opposing Israel, the state, and Zionism, the ethno-nationalist ideology that underpins that state. Zionism is not Judaism. Let me say that again for the people up top. Zionism is not Judaism, right? It's a very modern, secular, political ideology movement that was founded less than 150 years ago by an atheist named Theodore Herzl, who said, and I quote, "The anti-Semites will be our most dependable friends, the anti-Semitic countries, our allies." His words, not mine. Number two, if you vote for this motion, you're throwing Palestinians as a people under the bus. You're telling an occupied people, a dispossessed people, to accept their own occupation, their own dispossession, meekly, in silence. Otherwise, they're racists. As my friend Yusuf Manaya, the Palestinian-American activist, says, to ask Palestinians not to be anti-Zionist is to ask Palestinians not to be. And number three, last but not least, if you vote for this motion, you're throwing a lot of Jews under the bus as well. Not just Jews like Edwin Samuel Montagu, but Jews today. If you vote for this motion tonight, you're saying my debate partner, Gideon Levy, whose grandparents were killed in the Holocaust, who served for Shimon Peres, who's written for Haaretz for over 40 years, just won Israel's top journalism prize 3 years ago, he's an anti-Semite. You're saying the Satmar, the world's biggest Hasidic Jewish sect, which says it is fighting God's war against Zionism, is anti-Semitic. You're saying Jewish college students on campus, maybe some of them are your kids, members of If Not Now and Jewish Voices for Peace, they're anti-Semites. You're saying some of the most respected Jewish voices in the world, like Abraham Berg, the former Speaker of the Parliament, Miriam Margolis, the actress from Harry Bloody Potter, they're all anti-Semites. That is what you're saying. That is what you're signing off on if you vote for this motion tonight. So I have a simple solution for you all.
Mehdi Hasan does not provide a deeper insight into his side of the argument. However, blatantly criticizes Douglas's argument, stating his statements stated earlier were utterly rubbish. He takes Edwin Samuel Montagu as an example here to prove his point about anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism.
Let me first say, Gideon, you started with a peroration about me not mentioning the Palestinian casualties. That's because I started by mentioning the war, and there is no law of war that says you're allowed to start a war and then complain when you lose it. And if Mehdi cares about the Palestinian casualties, as I'm sure he does, then tell your bosses in Qatar to tell their friends in Gaza to stop the war and give back the hostages.
Montague's opposition to Zionism was based on his belief that Zionism could potentially harm Jewish communities worldwide. He argued that anti-Zionism, as expressed by some, might not necessarily be anti-Semitic, but could be motivated by genuine concerns about the political implications of a Jewish state. Montague has stated that Zionism is a threat to Jewish integration rather than a direct manifestation of anti-Semitic sentiment. Do you think anti-Zionism can be a cover for anti-Semitic beliefs?
Let me just say a couple of things about that I didn't get to in my opening remarks, but are important. You know, if you didn't throng the streets of this city or any other for the actual genocide going on in Sudan, not the one that Mehdi and Gideon pretend is happening, but the actual genocide going on in Sudan, if you didn't spend weekend after weekend doing that, but you did come out for the post-October the 7th protests, you're an anti-Semite. If, like Mehdi once sent a tweet condemning that, it doesn't give you quite enough smoke cover. You know, if you protested not a bit, didn't set up a tent when Bashar al-Assad was killing 6 times the number of people in a decade that Israel and all of its enemies have lost in 75 years of war, you are an anti-Semite. And I would just add one other thing. I know that Mehdi has tried to reframe the motion. I'm not going to allow it either. You know, maybe there is somebody in the world. Pakistan was invented, created as a state around the same time as Israel. I reckon that if this debate tonight was about Pakistan started a lot of wars, it suffered a lot of wars, it suffered a lot of casualties, caused a lot of casualties. But you know what? If somebody said, I think Pakistan should be abolished. They just don't have the right to a state, and although they had one set up for them many decades ago, we should abolish it. I think people would say, And then if the person said, but, oh, by the way, although I want to abolish that state, I have no problem with the Pakistani people. Please, please, of course you would.
Douglas Murray challenges the opposing argument with compelling rebuttals that leave speechless. Murray suggests that for Gaza and Palestine to end the conflict, they should start by returning the Israeli hostages and ensuring mutual protection to prevent further harm, which I fully agree with. Murray points out that Israel is often held to different standards compared to other countries. This double standard, he argues, can be indicative of anti-Semitic bias. Are the double standards concerning Jews, their race, and related stereotypes often dismissed without regard?
The fact that Natasha started the speech by saying, our side cannot define Zionism, anti-Zionism, or anti-Semitism. So Gideon, you and I should just go check out the CN Tower, because I'm not sure what the debate's about. We're being told by the proposition that we must follow their definitions of what we're here to argue and vote about, which tells you how authoritarian that side of the motion. This debate for me tonight is fascinating, because for years Douglas has been the free speech warrior, and I've been the guy saying there's no right to absolute free speech. Tonight I feel the roles are reversed. I'm here to say, what happened to free speech? What happened to the ability to criticize others, governments, countries, yes, political ideologies? Natasha, Theodore Herzl would be surprised to hear you say it wasn't a political ideology or a national movement. And I just find it fascinating that Natasha made it very clear that non-Jews cannot define anything to do with this. And then Douglas stepped up and accused every Jewish protester against Israel of being an anti-Semite, which I find offensive and ridiculous. Thousands upon thousands of Jews. You don't have to agree with them, remember. You don't have to agree with them. But they took their right to go out on the streets in Toronto, in DC, in New York, in London, in Paris, all over the world, in Tel Aviv, to protest against what's happening in Gaza. And Douglas, one of the world's most proud atheists, not Jewish as far as I know, just damned them all as anti-Semites. Wow, that speaks volumes about where this debate is going and who is defining what and how. As for Natasha's line and Douglas's line that if you don't support self-determination for a particular group, you're a bigot, well, you know, we've already had a lot of votes, so I won't ask you to click. I don't have power over your clickers. But I'd love to know how many people in this room either were in the last Quebec referendum or supported it from afar. But just so Douglas will call him an anti-Semite later. As he pointed out, the Basques, the Catalans, the Kurds, the Scots, they don't have states. And if you oppose them having states, you're not an anti-Kurd bigot, you're not an anti-Scot bigot, you're not an anti-Catalan bigot. People have arguments all the time. There are 5,000 indigenous groups in the world today. According to the UN, there are 193 member states of the UN. You do the math, right? So this is ridiculous, this argument that we are being expected to believe that if you don't support Israel as it is currently constituted, with Jewish supremacy, as Gideon points out, that makes you an anti-Semite. It's an abuse of anti-Semitism. It empties at a very important concept, at a very urgent time of all meaning, in order to defend a country which, as Gideon has pointed out, and which Douglas seems to think is fine, has killed tens of thousands of innocent people in recent months.
Mehdi Hasan once again accuses Murray, this time pointing out that if free speech is upheld and promoted everywhere in Western Europe, then why is discussing Israelis or protesting against the motion considered wrong and often interrupted? Do you think this is anti-Semitic?
Certainly, no doubt, on many people's minds. To address Gideon and Mehdi's point about what is legitimate in this debate in terms of the criticism of Zionism and what is illegitimate. Well, give us a sense of your parameters here, because they're making an argument that, you know, this is a debate. We are having a debate today, are we not? So is all of this off the table? What's on the table? Give us, calibrate for us your understanding of Zionism.
Let me just reiterate, because we started this debate with a definition put up behind us on the screens, and however much Mehdi and Gideon want to reframe it, it's quite straightforward. Zionism, I repeat, is the right of the Jewish people to self-determination in their historic homeland. Anti-Semitism is cruel double standards towards Jews and cruel and unfair treatment of them as Jews. When I wish I could say I'm amazed by what Gideon has said, but I recently watched your interview on Al Jazeera where you said that when the interviewer said to you how many people in Israel agree with you, and you said you could fit them in a phone box. And that's true. That is absolutely true. You are as obscure a figure in Israeli society as it's possible to find. And I'll give you an example of why. Natasha just picked Mehdi up on an important lie. You could say it's just an elision or a mistake he made because he hadn't read the primary sources, but I cannot allow Gideon to get away with what he just said, which was an unbelievable lie. He said, Israel isn't a democracy. First of all, I don't know, maybe, have you ever been there?
Yes.
When?
A few years ago, not recently. I don't get awards from the president of Israel like you do, so I don't get to do softball interviews.
Well,
I didn't get invited into Gaza.
If I were you, let me finish my point.
But you went to Gaza, right? You said you went to Gaza. How come you went to Gaza when the world's media is not allowed into Gaza?
There's two reasons.
But they took you into Gaza.
Well, first of all, I'll explain, but let me pick up my point since you keep trying to derail me. There are two ways to go into Gaza. One is with the IDF, which is what I did and what most Western journalists have done. The other is to go in with Hamas. You could probably go in with Hamas. I can't.
Douglas Murray obliterates Hasan by stating how the double standards are still being carried out and the unjust treatment Israelis face. This statement applies even today, and this evidently shows how much Palestinians are considerate about the negotiation and spreading peace.
Secondly, so you see, if I was on stage tonight busily flying around the world to busily defame a democracy, I would spend a bit of time there, Mehdi. I would spend a bit of time there because everything you said about it, like Gideon, is totally untrue. And I'll just give one other thing. Gideon said an appalling thing just there, that this is not about annihilation. One of the heads of Hamas, 2012, kill them all the Jews, don't leave a single one. Ismail Haniyeh, 2017, children are tools to be used against Israel, we'll sacrifice them for them. Yahya Sinwar, who planned the 7th, we will take down the border with Israel and tear their hearts out from their bodies. I'll tell you something, ladies and gentlemen, from what I've seen, which you scorn because you are an armchair journalist. I'll tell you what I've seen. When Yahya Sinwar said that we want to rip the hearts out of the Jews, it wasn't rhetoric. They did it. They mean it. And only this side wants to pretend they don't, for whatever reasons a psychologist would have to explain.
Okay, let me... Sorry, he called me... Let me respond. Let's do this.
I want to see if all four of you can work with me to work through some of the questions that are on the mind of this audience who are going to have to vote on this resolution at the end of the evening. So, Mehdi, have a quick response, but then let's get focused back on this question of why do you think Zionism is a movement, an ism, like anti-Americanism or anti-Britishism or whatever it is? I want to hear more on that so this audience can make an informed choice at the end of the night.
Yes, but let me just deal with a few things that Douglas said, because there were a few things were said. I mean, it's amusing. I wasn't surprised at all. I came to a debate in Toronto to debate Israel with two defenders of the current government, and so far Gideon and I, correct me if I'm wrong, didn't call... We could have done a long list of you're apologists for genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity. We didn't do that, but we've been called liars and Hamas supporters, and I get it. Neither of us talked about Hamas. We don't support Hamas. This is not a debate about Hamas. I know Douglas wants to redefine it as a debate about Hamas. Great, good for him, because he can't actually deal with the arguments we're putting forward. All the Jews who are putting forward these arguments, they're all anti-Semites, remember. I just want to deal with one point very important here. Douglas is the great journalist in Israel. I love this. Cosplaying as a journalist, going into Gaza with the IDF. Douglas interviewed Benjamin Netanyahu in January. Douglas did not... you're very bothered by Qatar and funding Hamas.
They're your bosses.
But, well, we're talking about bosses. Let's talk to this.
You're literally paid by them. I've interviewed Qatari officials. You could go on YouTube and watch my interviews with Qatari officials. And then you could watch Douglas interview Benjamin Netanyahu, where he asked him pearls like, is there another chapter left in the Netanyahu biography? That was the strong question for that. He didn't ask Benjamin Netanyahu, why did you work with Qatar to fund Hamas all those years? Why did you prop up Hamas all those years? Why, according to today's Israeli media, did you have reports that there was going to be an attack on your citizens and completely allow that to happen? Douglas didn't ask any of those questions. Instead, he'd like to spray around Hamas at the Muslim on the stage. Douglas referred to Hamza Yusuf, the First Minister of Scotland recently, as the First Minister of Gaza. Muslim guy, and he said, quote, you said, quote, he has infiltrated our system. Given we're at a debate about anti-Semitism, I find it ironic that you are throwing out some of the most bigoted dual loyalty tropes known to man, referring to a born British Muslim politician as the First Minister of Gaza. Since he's leveled that, I have to correct it. First of all, you obviously didn't see the whole interview of Netanyahu. You'd have seen the first question was one that no one else has asked him. But anyway.
Did you ask about his support for Qatar and hostages?
Gentlemen, we're going to reset.
Douglas, did you ask him about
It's lovely to have the Douglas and Mehdi show, but we have two other presenters on this panel that are...
Douglas Murray proceeds to provide the statistics on how many Israelis have been affected due to the war and Palestine attack on Israel. However, Mehdi Hasan chooses to blatantly ignore the truth and accuse Douglas Murray of being honest. Hasan also accuses the human rights implications of Israeli policies and the suffering of Palestinians. However, he proceeds to deny the fact that Palestine could effortlessly take the initiative to resolve the war.
They asked the Israelis, she's parroting propaganda from the Israeli government. The Israeli government was asked to give evidence. They refused to give their evidence. Every Western government, including your own, Canada's, has restarted funding because they looked at the evidence and didn't see it. That's great. I get it. But as Douglas might have once said, facts don't care about your feelings. To come back to the other point of lie, Douglas says the war would end if Hamas gave back the hostages. Complete lie. The Israelis have said, even if the hostages come back, we carry on the war. In fact, I interviewed Avraham Munter's nephew. Avraham Munter is a 79-year-old Israeli hostage right now. Poor guy, tragic. 79-year-old in captivity, should be freed, of course, had to have his birthday in captivity. His nephew says that every time he goes on the streets, Ben Gvir's police beat him. They beat him and arrest him. They're arresting hostage members' families, hostage family members. And they're coming on TV and saying, why are we being used as props by people who support the war? He doesn't support the war. He wants a deal. Israeli family members are going on the streets and being tear-gassed and water cannon or whatever, beaten by the police because they want a deal and they want an end to the war that Douglas and Zasha so proudly support. They keep telling us about the horrors of October the 7th. I agree. This side shares the revulsion against the horrors of October the 7th, but we also share revulsion against the horrors that came since October the 7th. We don't support those horrors. I'm opposed to the war crimes that happened on October the 7th and the war crimes that have happened since October the 7th. Douglas, no, I've got to finish this point. I've got to finish this point. Douglas, the week after October the 7th, came out in The Spectator and advocated for the ethnic cleansing of Gaza, which is a crime against humanity under the Rome Statute. He said now is
not true.
You said now is a good time to do it.
Everyone can read the piece other than Mehdi.
Rudyard, I'm going to ask to respond to that because it's clear Mehdi didn't listen to a single word that I said.
That if you criticize any politician in Israel or any action of the Israeli government, you are therefore an anti-Semite. Neither of us said that at any point. Secondly, at no point on this side have we said that this is a zero-sum game between the Israelis and the Palestinians or the Israelis and the Arabs. There is no reason why a Jewish state should not be able to live side by side with another Arab-Palestinian state. Okay? The only, and I'm glad that Gideon brought up Oslo, the only reason that there is not a Palestinian state today, not the Palestinian Authority, which runs most of the West Bank, or Hamas, that was given the Gaza and then decided to do, well, we know what they decided to do with 18 years of international funding from this country and others. Not that, but if they were given another state, there is no reason, if they brought their children up to love life and to live by their neighbors, if they educated their children into learning instead of hate, there is no reason why they could not live in a state beside a Jewish state. And there's no reason why Zionism opposes that. And it doesn't. But once again, Gideon and Mehdi said something without giving you the context. You said that when Israel was involved in Oslo, the world loved it. Well, we all have our different histories and interpretations of that, I'm sure. Maybe it just looks better in the rearview mirror. The reality is that the Oslo process massively changed Israel. Why? Because the Israeli public and their politicians went for peace and they got intifada. They went for peace and they got suicide bombers at nightclubs in Tel Aviv. And one reason why Gideon is such an extremely rare voice in Israel, and congratulations, Mehdi, you know the drill, you can always find a Jew on your side who'll support what you do. But the reason why Gideon is such an unusual voice in Israel is because most Israelis learned from that intifada what it means, what the teaching of hate to Palestinian children means, and now, after October the 7th, they've learned it 1,000-fold. The people who were killed in the communities beside Gaza were people who dreamed of peace just as much as you do, if not more. And I can tell you that of the young people dancing at the Nova party that night, that morning, the young people dancing at that party massacred, raped, shot, kidnapped for the crime of dancing. There's not one of those kids who didn't dream of the day they could dance with their Palestinian brothers and sisters.
Murray asserts nothing but the truth. Israelis and Palestinians can potentially live side by side without issues if people looked at the war and the reasons for protest from a wider angle. He also firmly believes that criticizing the Israeli government and their policies is certainly not anti-Semitism, as it could help build up the country and its constitution.
One sentence to say about that is that the entire world wants a ceasefire, and the United States and Israel and, I don't know, the Micronesia and whatever else don't, right? The entire world takes a very different view, unfortunately, to the people in this room and to Douglas and Natasha. The International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice, the UNHCR, UNICEF, Doctors Without Borders, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, Oxfam, Christian Aid. Yep, you're booing. What does it come to when you're booing Oxfam? What does that tell you about yourselves? You're sitting here booing Oxfam to defend Benjamin Netanyahu. Let me just deal with something you just said. You talked about debunking propaganda. First of all, you can't even get Israeli propaganda straight. The Israeli government's own security agency, Shin Bet, investigated what you just said and said, no, we found no evidence that workers from Gaza were involved in the October 7th attack. Oh, Shin Bet are lying. They're booing Shin Bet, the Israeli security service. Got it. All right, let me finish my point. You had a 5-minute speech from your side. Okay. That's Shin Bet. let me just deal with your wider point here. Douglas and Natasha tonight want to make this entire debate about October 7th. I get it. It's a horror show. But that's not the debate. The debate was about Zionism, and it tells you a lot that they can't find any arguments to say, as Gideon says, why we can't be allowed to criticize a political ideology that is 150 years old, that many Jewish people have criticized from the beginning and continue to do so. They can't tell you why that is. So they focus on October the 7th, which is fine, but if you're going to focus on October 7th, then also focus on what happened since October the 7th, the erasure of Palestinians in this debate, the booing when Gideon mentions what happened to Palestinians. Shameful. I'm sorry to say, it's absolutely shameful and telling about what's going on. And I would say this, if we're going to talk about October 7th and what happened since, everyone's a liar, the Hamas health ministry is a liar, everyone's a liar. Okay, friend of mine, American doctor, goes to Gaza. Many doctors have gone to Gaza. You've seen them on the news, they're all liars, all Hamas apparently. Friend of mine went to Gaza. He's been to Sudan. He doesn't just use it for whataboutism like Douglas. He's been to Sudan. He's been to Afghanistan. He's worked there. He came back from Gaza and said, I've never seen atrocities like I've seen here. What's happened to children? He's an anti-Semite because he saw children with burn wounds like he's never seen. He saw children with gunshot wounds to the head. To the head, but that's Hamas's fault. Everything is Hamas's fault. So let's talk about war crimes. It is amazing that every human rights group in the world, including Israeli human rights groups like B'Tselem, Gisha, Yeshbin, are all documenting this stuff, but you guys think it's all imaginary.
He also discusses the Oslo process, a series of agreements and negotiations between Israel and the Palestine Liberation Organization. The initial discussions in 1993 brought hope for resolving the conflict by aiming for a peace treaty. However, the challenges and criticisms remained unchanged. Continued violence, including suicide bombings by Palestinian groups and harsh Israeli military responses, eroded the trust that was slowly being built.
So again, it tells you about what Zionism is. This is not about some abstract ideology of, people trying to settle the land and trying to have it. But as Gideon said, there was an argument to be had in the 1940s, 30s, 20s. Zionism today is what the Palestinians are enduring on a daily, nightly basis in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, in Israel itself. And the erasure of that tells you everything about why we need to be able to talk about what Zionism does to the Palestinians without being smeared as anti-Semites.
Okay, Douglas?
Hasan again contradicts Douglas Murray's previous statements and blatantly accuses his side of the argument. Do you think people who criticize the Israeli government are anti-Semitic?
I've seen, for instance, one of the bodies of the terrorists. Well, no, you're just trying to make a cheap debating point again.
No, it's called a fact.
Let me make the point which, instead of you making your cheap debating point, is a fact which you should think of imbibing. Just stop it for a moment, Mehdi, and listen.
Please, go. Come on. Give us your facts.
I'll give you one example. The terrorists who came into Ofer-Kim, which is many miles from the border, on the bodies of the 12 terrorists who made it into that settlement, into that community there, in Ofer-Kim, I have seen the map on the body of at least one of the terrorists, and it had on the map the house of a member of the Knesset who lived there, the house where the synagogue was going to be because it was a holy day, and the kindergarten. Now, I'll give you one other example. In Niroz, excuse me, because you lied again. Because you lied again and pretended that what Natasha just said was not the case. And I'm telling you
what Shin Bet says.
No, you're not, Mehdi.
As
usual, you're making a cheap point for your partisan reasons. And I am telling you,
I have seen, but I'm the chief debater.
I have seen the precise maps of the communities I'm afraid I am. More reliable than you and your bosses in Qatar.
You're not, Douglas. Oh, my boss is in Qatar, not chief debating. Douglas, you're the guy. Sorry, let's just be clear. You're the guy who denied earlier that what you said in the Spectator. Let's just be the clear content. We're talking about October 7th, October 7th. 5 days after October 7th, you said maybe they will finally put an end to this insoluble nightmare, raise Hamas to the ground, or clear all the Palestinians from that benighted strip. It could be a good time to do it, but you tell this audience we can live in peace side by side. That's a war crime. No. Ethnic cleansing is a war crime. Not at all. Clearing people.
No, I said maybe for a reason.
It could be a good time to do it.
For goodness sake.
Douglas, just apologize and move on.
Brilliant.
Seriously.
Talking about moving on, we are now going to move on to closing statements because the time for this portion of the debate has come to a close.
What are your opinions on this? Do you think anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism? Let us know in the comments. If you want to witness more of Douglas Murray's heated debates, make sure to check out our channel.